Just a nurse. That's what Dr. Ashford said to the resident when Katie Morrison suggested an adjustment to the ventilator settings during a code 3 weeks prior. Not even loud enough for her to hear directly, but she heard it anyway, the way people always hear the things designed to cut them. Just a nurse. As if the word nurse was something smaller than it should be. As if the hands holding a man's sternum together while his heart restarted were interchangeable with anyone else's hands. He didn't know. That was the thing about Dr. Ashford. He had no idea who was restocking the crash carts at 6 in the morning while the attending physicians were still drinking their second cup of coffee. Katie Morrison clocks into Oak Creek Memorial at 0600, her sneakers squeaking against the polished linoleum of the trauma unit. The Portland rain hammers the emergency department windows like applause for a show nobody wanted to watch. She moves through the corridors with practiced efficiency, head down, eyes forward, speaking only when spoken to. The antiseptic smell mixes with stale coffee from the break room, a scent she stopped noticing 3 years ago. She touches the dog tag beneath her scrubs, a habit now, the broken chain pressing cold against her collarbone. The metal catches the fluorescent light just enough to remind her it's still there. Still real. The other nurses greet her with polite distance. 3 years at Oak Creek and they know only surface details. Katie never misses a shift, never complains, never volunteers personal information. They know she eats lunch alone in her car. They know she limps slightly favoring her left leg, that a thin scar runs from her jawline down her neck, barely visible under her collar. What they don't know is that the limp comes from shrapnel that nicked the femoral nerve, that the scar is from an RPG blast at Bagram that took out her entire medical unit, that the dog tag belongs to her husband who died when she was 24 years old and major in the United States Army Medical Corps. She heads to the supply room first, restocking the crash cart with methodical precision. 14-gauge angiocath needles. Endotracheal tubes in sizes 6.0 through 8.5. The Reboa balloon catheter in its emergency case. She knows every instrument by touch, could assemble a full resuscitation kit in darkness if she had to. Her hands move with the kind of muscle memory that only comes from doing something for real, under fire, with someone's life actual blood pooling beneath your palms. But here at Oak Creek, her hands are supposed to be trembling. Uncertain. Deferential. She learned to make them appear that way. It's easier that way. Easier to keep your head down when people already see you as small. The scanner crackles. Incoming trauma. Male, early 40s, significant shrapnel wounds to the anterior and lateral chest, training accident at Fort Lewis, ETA for minutes. The ER transforms instantly, that controlled chaos that looks like panic to outsiders but is actually the opposite. Nurses move. Residents respond. The trauma bay becomes a stage lit by halogen and purpose. Katie's securing supplies when Dr. Ashford sweeps past with his usual entourage, 2 residents trailing like pilot fish, a medical student trying to look competent. Ashford is tall in the way wealthy men sometimes are, with the kind of posture that suggests he's never once doubted his position in a room. His tie is silk. His watch costs more than Katie's monthly rent. He moves through the trauma unit like he owns it, which, technically, as chief of surgery, he does. He glances past her without registering her presence at all. To him, she's part of the background, furniture that occasionally picks things up and puts them down. Katie finishes securing the cart and wheels it into Trauma Bay 2, the fluorescent lights humming their persistent electric drone. The bay is prepped. Monitors ready. The team assembled. She positions herself at the foot of the gurney, hand steady, waiting. The doors burst open and the major arrives like a question nobody wanted asked. His field uniform is soaked in blood. The medics have cut away his shirt already, protocol, and his chest is mapped with shrapnel wounds, small dark punctures with darker edges. The training accident description was understated. This looks like a man who survived something that should have killed him already. The trauma surgeon from the field unit is still riding the gurney, calling out vitals with the clipped efficiency of someone who's seen worse. BP 88/56 and dropping. Heart rate 138, thready. Respiration 24, shallow. O2 sat 91% on high flow. Multiple penetrating wounds to the chest, possible cardiac involvement, possible tension pneumothorax. The Major's eyes are open. Still conscious. Still here. And Katie recognizes him instantly. It's Derek Holloway. Major Derek Holloway. The commanding officer of her 17-year-old son's newly formed Special Forces unit. Marcus had mentioned him exactly once during their brief phone call last week. My CO is incredible, Mom, he's the real deal, and she'd filed the name away in the part of her mind that catalogues things about her son's life that she's forced to let go of. Special Forces. It meant Marcus was going somewhere she couldn't follow, doing things she couldn't know about, becoming a man she might not recognize when he came home. If he came home. Now that same Major is bleeding out on her gurney. Dr. Ashford strides into the bay with the confidence of a man who has never failed at anything in his life. He reviews the field notes in approximately 3 seconds and begins calling orders. Massive transfusion protocol. Get him to the OR. We're prepping for thoracotomy, possible cardiac injury, possible hemopericardium. Move. The team pivots. Nurses push the gurney. Residents follow like trained dogs. Dr. Ashford is already calculating, already narrating the next 3 steps in his mind, already envisioning the surgical approach that will save this man's life because that's what Dr. Ashford does. He saves lives. He does it brilliantly. And he never, ever considers the input of a trauma nurse with trembling hands and a haunted look in her eyes. Except Katie Morrison is moving too. She's moving with a precision that catches nobody's attention because she's supposed to be moving. She's supposed to be adjusting the 4 lines and calling out secondary surveys and doing the 100 small things that keep a dying man stable during the 60 seconds between the ER and the operating room. What she's doing is something different entirely. She's running through the damage assessment in her mind, cross-referencing the entry wounds with the exit wounds, calculating trajectory based on angle and depth, because she did this for real once. She did this in a courtyard at Bagram while a man bled out beside her, and she used a combat knife to perform a field thoracotomy because he had a hemothorax and the surgical team was 17 minutes out, and sometimes 17 minutes is a lifetime. The memory hits her like cold water. The operating room is prepped. The Major is draped. The surgical lights come down bright enough to bleach out color. Ashford is scrubbing in, his movements precise and confident, already narrating the approach for the residents. We're going to open the left chest, assess for cardiac penetration, control the hemorrhage, and Katie is standing at the supply table, setting up the instrument tray, when she watches Ashford make the first incision. The blade goes in and blood comes up immediately, dark and aggressive. The pneumothorax releases with an audible rush, air escaping from somewhere it shouldn't be. The field isn't clearing as quickly as it should. The bleeding isn't responding to pressure the way it should. Something about the trajectory of the wounds is wrong for a standard thoracotomy approach. Katie has seen this before. She's seen this when she was holding someone's lungs together with her hands in the dust outside a military hospital. She's seen the way blood moves differently depending on which chamber of the heart is compromised. She's seen the difference between a clean approach and an approach that misses the actual injury by half an inch. She steps forward. The laceration is posterior to the pulmonary root, Katie says. Her voice is quiet. Deferential. Exactly the way a trauma nurse is supposed to sound when she's suggesting something to a chief of surgery. Field presentation suggests a penetrating injury to the inferior pulmonary vein rather than the cardiac chamber. Your current approach will miss it. The operating room goes silent. The silence lasts exactly 3 seconds. Then Dr. Ashford's face goes crimson, actual crimson, like someone turned up the heat under his skin. He sets down his instruments. He turns fully toward Katie, and the look in his eyes is something between fury and contempt. Are you suggesting, he says, his voice dropping into that tone physicians use when they're about to dismantle someone in front of an audience, that I, a chief of surgery with 22 years of cardiac experience, am missing a basic anatomical injury? Katie doesn't flinch. She doesn't look away. She doesn't retreat. She simply stands there in her scrubs with her hands folded, waiting for the rest of it. "You're a trauma nurse, Miss Morrison." He stretches her name out like it's an insult. "You have a GED plus nursing certification and approximately," he glances at his resident for confirmation, 3 years of experience in this trauma unit. "You do not perform diagnostic assessment. You do not redirect surgical approaches. You fetch supplies and call codes and stay in your lane. Do you understand me?" The major is still open on the table. His heart is still exposed. His lungs are still struggling. The bleeding is still not controlled. "Yes, Dr. Ashford," Katie says quietly. He turns back to his work, dismissing her as completely as if she's evaporated. Someone remove her from the OR. She's making everyone uncomfortable. One of the residents steps forward to physically escort her out, his face burning with secondhand embarrassment. But Katie doesn't move immediately. She stands there for one more second, watching the operating field, watching the blood pattern, watching the way Ashford is now working faster, because of course, his pride is now invested in proving her wrong. The cardiac valve. He's approaching the cardiac valve. When she steps back, when she allows herself to be removed from the room, her composure doesn't break. Her jaw doesn't clench. Her breathing doesn't change. The tremor in her hands, if there ever was a tremor, remains perfectly, professionally in place. But something shifts. Something small but absolute. Like a door closing. Like a decision being made. Dr. Ashford's write-up appeared on the unit board at 1,315 hours, printed on bright yellow paper that caught the fluorescent light like a warning beacon. Nurse K. M. Morrison, insubordination, overstepping scope of practice, written warning. The letters were large enough to read from the hallway. He'd made sure of that. Every staff member who passed would see it. Every resident, every attending, every medical student rotating through trauma would understand the message. The timid nurse in the corner had overstepped, and she'd been put in her place. Katie moved through post-op rounds that morning with her head down, aware of the glances following her, the way conversations died when she entered a room. The major was stable in Bay 7, monitors showing a steady rhythm, his oxygen saturation holding at 96%. She checked his dressing, no fresh bleeding, the surgical site clean and dry. His brother had been in the waiting room at 0600, arms crossed, watching everyone who passed. Katie hadn't approached. It wasn't her place anymore. She was supposed to be invisible. That had always been the plan. Clock in, keep your head down, rebuild your life one quiet shift at a time. 3 years at Oak Creek and no one had asked her name, her history, whether the calluses on her hands came from somewhere other than 4 lines and chest compressions. That was how you survived. That was how you existed without being seen. The break room at lunch was busy, for nurses clustered around a corner table, laughing about a patient's family member who'd tried to bribe them with homemade lasagna. Katie set her tray down at the table nearest the door, a habit from years of needing an exit route. She'd brought her own lunch, as always. Plain chicken, rice, an apple. Fuel, not pleasure. The moment she sat down, the conversation stopped. Sarah Chen exchanged a glance with Marcus, not the major, a different Marcus, one of the surgical techs, and they stood simultaneously. Their trays were still half full. Jennifer followed without a word. Then Miguel. All of them gathering their food and their judgment and walking out together, the message clear as a scalpel cut. Katie sat alone under the fluorescent hum, her fork in her hand, and didn't move. She took one measured breath. A single tear slid down her cheek, the first one in 3 years, and she wiped it away without breaking eye contact with the empty chair across from her. The tear came from somewhere deep, somewhere she'd sealed off the day her husband's unit came back with one less person. She was supposed to be past this. Past the anger, the betrayal, the weight of invisible scars. It was that exact moment, as if he'd been waiting in the hallway for his audience to leave, that Dr. Ashford appeared in the break room doorway. His eyes found her immediately. He moved toward her with the slow confidence of a man who'd never been told no by anyone who mattered. His white coat was pristine. His stethoscope hung around his neck like a medal. His face held the particular satisfaction of a man who'd just watched his work take effect. "Nurse Morrison." He said her name the way someone might say the name of a stain they'd spotted on a carpet. Katie set down her fork. She didn't stand. She didn't flinch. She looked up at him, directly at him, and something shifted in her eyes. The tear was gone. What replaced it was the particular clarity of someone who'd made a decision. "I've held men together with my bare hands while they bled out, Doctor," she said, her voice low and steady, each word placed like a scalpel. "I know exactly what I'm doing." The silence that followed was the kind you could operate in. Dr. Ashford's jaw clenched. He wasn't used to nurses looking at him like that. He wasn't used to being answered back. But before he could respond, before he could marshal his authority and crush this moment, Katie stood, gathered her tray, and walked past him toward the sink. She moved with the kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst, and it made something in the air pressure change. He watched her go, his hands balling into fists at his sides. By 1400 hours, Major Holloway's condition had stabilized completely. Post-op monitoring showed fair but improving vitals, blood pressure steady at 118/76, heart rate hovering around 72, oxygen saturation maintaining 97% on room air. The surgical team's notes indicated no complications from the intubation, no delayed hemorrhage, no signs of infection. He was sedated but stable, the kind of recovery that suggested he'd make it. The kind of outcome that proved good medicine, delivered quickly and decisively, saved lives. Katie saw this in the chart during her evening rounds at 18:30 hours. She didn't stop to celebrate. She didn't write her own notes or update his family. She simply read the data and moved on to the next patient. That was her job now. That was all it had ever been supposed to be. When she checked on Derek directly, the only critical patient she was still allowed near, she found him in ICU step down, the bay dimmed for his sedation. His vitals were displayed on the monitor in soft green numerals. She looked at him for exactly 10 seconds, the shape of his face, the bandaging across his chest, the 4 lines running into his left arm. His brother's sleeping form was visible through the window of the family waiting room, slumped in a chair, exhaustion finally winning the battle against vigilance. Katie adjusted Derek's for rate, verified the medication labels matched his chart, and left without speaking to anyone. At 2130 hours, Dr. Ashford called her into his office on the 3rd floor. No message sent through the charge nurse. No courtesy of advance notice. Just a resident finding her in the hallway with instructions, "Dr. Ashford wants to see you. Now." His office was paneled in dark wood that smelled like aged leather and old money. Medical diplomas hung on the walls: Columbia, Johns Hopkins residency, a fellowship in trauma surgery from some program that probably cost more than Katie made in a year. There were photographs too, him standing with hospital administrators, him receiving an award of some kind, him in surgical scrubs looking lean and authoritative. "Close the door," he said, not looking up from his computer. Katie closed it quietly. "I've been reviewing unit efficiency metrics," he began, still not meeting her eyes, "and I've decided to restructure the trauma rotation. We're overstaffed during day shifts. Understaffed at night. You're being moved to overnight effective immediately. Midnight to noon. That's a 7-day rotation starting tonight." She could feel the weight of this decision. Overnight shifts destroyed sleep patterns, fragmented your social life, isolated you from the rest of the staff. It was where they put the nurses they wanted to wear down. Where they sent people they'd marked as problems. "Understood," Katie said. "Do you understand?" He finally looked at her, his eyes flat and dark. "Because what I'm hearing is insubordination. What I'm seeing is a nurse who thinks she knows better than the physicians in charge. And I don't tolerate that. Not in my unit." Katie met his gaze without flinching. "I understand." He leaned back in his chair, which creaked under his weight. "Your first shift starts tonight. The charge nurse has your assignment. You'll be pulling stable post-ops and admissions. No critical patients. No code involvement unless I personally authorize it. Clear. Clear. Get out. She turned and left, the office door closing behind her with a soft click that sounded like a lock turning. She had 9 hours before midnight. 9 hours to figure out how to rebuild a life that had just fractured again, and 9 hours wasn't nearly enough. At 2,345 hours, Katie clocked in for her first overnight shift and collected her patient assignment from the charge nurse, who wouldn't meet her eyes. 7 patients. All stable. All post-op or routine admissions. None of them in critical condition. None of them requiring the particular expertise that came from holding someone together while arterial bleeding counted down the seconds before irreversible shock. She was moving between rooms at 0200 hours when the code bell sounded from the ICU step-down bay. The sound cut through the quiet hospital like an alarm, and her body moved before her mind caught up. Muscle memory. 12 years of muscle memory, 3 tours of muscle memory, 2 Purple Hearts worth of understanding what a code bell meant. Someone was dying. She was 20 feet from the bay when a resident she didn't recognize stepped into the hallway and blocked her path. He was young, probably a PGY01, with the particular arrogance that came from having recently passed their boards and not yet learned how little they knew. "This patient is not assigned to you," he said, his voice carrying the administrative weight of someone repeating someone else's orders. Through the window of the bay, Katie could see them crowding around the bed. 1, 2, 3, for doctors in white coats. Then more appearing from the corridor. 5, 6, 7, 8. The entire on-call surgical team, all of them converging on Major Derek Holloway's room with the coordinated urgency of a response protocol being activated. But there were more behind them. Hospitalists from ICU. The intensivist who ran night shift. The senior resident from general surgery who'd been documenting charts down the hall. 1, 2, 3, 4 of them, filling the small bay until the room was packed wall-to-wall with medical credentials and ego and institutional power. 12. She counted them all. 12 white coats surrounding a single patient on a stretcher. "The patient is not assigned to you," the resident repeated, moving to block her view of the window. Katie stopped moving. She stood in the hallway with her hands at her sides and watched the chaos through the small rectangular window of the ICU bay. The monitors were screaming. Someone was calling out vitals she couldn't quite hear through the glass. Chest compressions. Defibrillation pads. The major's body jerking with voltage. 12 doctors. All of them there. All of them supposedly experts. And something in the way they moved, the way they seemed to be talking over each other rather than coordinating, the way the compressions weren't synchronized with the medication pushes, something told her exactly what was about to happen. "I said you're not assigned to this patient," the resident said again, and Katie realized he was nervous. That he knew she'd been watching. That he'd been given explicit instructions not to let her near this bay. The monitor alarm sang its flat, mechanical song at 2:03 in the morning. One continuous tone, unwavering and absolute. Katie stood outside the ICU window, her badge clipped to a lanyard that caught the fluorescent light, the same light that made everything below look like it was happening underwater. Major Derek Holloway's chest had stopped moving. The ventilator still pushed air into his lungs, but his heart had abandoned the work it was supposed to do. Pulmonary embolism. She could see it in the monitor patterns, could see it in the way his oxygen saturation had plummeted from 94 to 72 in 40 seconds flat. Blood clot to the lungs. Textbook presentation. Fixable presentation. The crash cart arrived at 2:04. Then another. Then another. The ICU erupted into controlled chaos, the kind that looked practiced because it was. 12 doctors flooded the room. Every member of the on-call surgical team. All for hospitalists covering the ICU. 12. The number felt obscene. 12 of the best-trained minds in the Pacific Northwest converging on one broken major like wolves circling wounded prey. They knew what they were doing. Katie could read the choreography from outside the glass: compression, medication, defibrillation, compression again. The rhythm of a code that was supposed to end in victory. Dr. Ashford stood at the head of the bed, his voice cutting through the organized noise like a scalpel. He called out orders with the kind of casual authority that comes from 18 years of making life-and-death decisions stick. Charge to 300. The defibrillator paddles came up. The Major's body jolted against the mattress, a puppet on electric strings. Nothing. The monitor remained flat. Ashford didn't hesitate. Epi 4 push. 1 milligram. Resume compressions. A resident, young enough to still have hope creasing the corners of his eyes, pumped the chest with steady, practiced rhythm. 1, 2, 3, 4. The percussion of a heartbeat that wasn't there. Katie's hand rested against the glass. The cold of it traveled up her arm like an accusation. Through the window, she could see every detail with the terrible clarity of someone trained to read a room in seconds. The monitors showing flat line. The 4 lines running like roads to nowhere. The ventilator's mechanical breath carrying oxygen to lungs that couldn't use it. The Major's face, pale as hospital sheets, the kind of pale that came from blood loss and shock and the body shutting down its peripheral systems to keep the brain alive a few seconds longer. The resident who'd blocked her from the bay earlier stood in the corridor behind her, close enough that she could hear him breathing. His jaw was tight. His eyes tracked Dr. Ashford like a hawk tracking a mouse. "Don't," the resident said quietly. Not a question. A warning. He knew what she was thinking because he'd seen it before, a nurse watching a code and recognizing something the doctors had missed, or were about to miss, or had chosen to ignore because the algorithm said this patient was already gone. But Katie wasn't looking at the algorithm. She was looking at the monitor patterns, at the specific shape of the flat line and what it told her. Not asystole. Not complete heart failure. A rhythm that looked dead because it was moving too slowly, too weakly, with a pattern that matched massive PE with a stunned myocardium, a heart that wasn't firing, not because it couldn't, but because the shock of the blood clot had temporarily disabled it. Stunned. Not dead. She'd seen this before. At Bagram, during a field thoracotomy on a sergeant whose chest cavity had been opened with a combat knife because it was the only way to reach the bleeding, she'd watched a heart that looked exactly like this one restart under direct manual massage. The surgeons had given up. She hadn't. The clock on the wall read 2:07. For minutes of continuous compressions. 12 doctors working in concert, their faces showing the particular exhaustion that came from trying to resurrect someone whose body was already cold. At 2:08, Dr. Ashford's voice changed. The timbre dropped. The certainty went flat. "That's it," he said. "We did everything we could. I'm calling it. Time of death, 02:08 hours." The statement fell into the room like a gravestone. The doctor stepped back from the bed in perfect unison, a synchronized retreat that looked almost choreographed. Gloves snapped off and hit the trash in a percussion section of abandonment. The code cart rolled away. Nurses began the ritual of disconnecting lines, removing the machinery of resuscitation, preparing the body for what came next. Katie watched the Major's brother arrive in the corridor. She didn't know his name, but she recognized the bearing, military, same as Derek, same as the 100 men she'd served beside. He moved like someone expecting to be given orders. Dr. Ashford met him at the threshold, and even without hearing the words, Katie could read the message in the slope of Ashford's shoulders. "I did everything I could. He's gone." The brother's hand reached for the door frame to steady himself, but the frame didn't offer enough. His knees bent. A visitor's chair was there, and he collapsed into it like someone had cut his strings. Marcus's commanding officer. The man responsible for keeping her 17-year-old son alive during training exercises that pushed the boundary between preparation and execution. Dead. Dr. Ashford walked toward the ICU door, stepping into the corridor with the tired satisfaction of a man who had performed his duty and could now let the weight of it drop onto someone else's shoulders. His tie was still pristine. His hands were still steady. He had walked away from that room the way generals walk away from battlefields, with the particular exhaustion of command, not the desperation of failure. Katie stepped into the bay before he passed her. She didn't ask permission. She didn't wait for acknowledgement. She simply moved, the way muscles move when they know the pattern better than the brain can think it. Past the resident. Past the nurses still removing lines. Straight to the bedside where the major lay with his eyes half open and his pupils still reactive and his chest still warm. "He's not gone," Katie said. Her voice didn't carry the question mark that would have made it a request for permission. It carried the period that came from certainty. Dr. Ashford spun. His face rearranged itself from fatigue into something sharper. "Excuse me." Katie was already checking pupils, already running her hand across the chest wall, already reading the body the way she'd learned to read it in a forward operating base where there were no second opinions and no appeal process. Just diagnosis and decision and the space between life and death that was smaller than most people imagined. "Massive pulmonary embolism," she said. "His heart stunned, not dead. If we—" Ashford's hand closed around her arm. His grip was precise, the kind of precise that came from strength held in reserve. "I said the code is over, Nurse Morrison." Each word came out like a separate accusation. "Leave this room immediately or you're fired. Do you understand me?" His voice had risen enough that the 12 doctors paused in their retreat. The nurses stopped moving. The entire ICU had become an audience, and Katie was standing in the center of a spotlight that felt hotter than any surgical lamp. She looked at the major's face. Still there. Still salvageable. Then at his brother, slumped in the visitor's chair with his hands covering his eyes. Then back at Dr. Ashford, whose grip on her arm was beginning to hurt in a way that felt almost personal. She pulled her arm free. The movement was careful, controlled, not a struggle, just a separation. The kind of deliberate disengagement that came from knowing her own strength and choosing not to use it. Not yet. She reached for the crash cart. The one the nurses had already begun wheeling away. Her hand caught it with the kind of certainty that stopped momentum. The cart stopped. Ashford's face went through 3 different colors of red, like a traffic light nobody had been watching. "Security," he said to someone, a nurse, a resident, anyone who would listen. "Security, now." But Katie wasn't listening. She was already checking the defibrillator pads, already reaching for the medication kit, already moving with the kind of precision that came from hands that had held a man's ribcage open with a knife and reached inside to massage a heart back to life because there was no other choice and no time to think about the ethics of the choice once you'd made it. The silence in the ICU became a physical thing. It pressed against the walls like atmospheric pressure, like the moment before a thunderstorm decides to break. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The flat line continued its mechanical song, the same 4 notes over and over, a lullaby for someone already dead or someone about to wake up. The flat line continued its mechanical song, the same 4 notes over and over, when Katie moved. Not toward the door. Toward the crash cart. She yanked it back to the bedside in one fluid motion, her hand already positioning the defibrillation pads, her body moving on muscle memory that had nothing to do with 3 years at Oak Creek Memorial. 200 joules. The major's chest arched. Nothing. The monitor's rhythm didn't change. She started compressions. Her hands found the sternum, heel of the right palm crossed over the left, and the rhythm took over, a cadence she'd learned not in nursing school but in a field station at Bagram where the power cut out and the only timer was her own heartbeat. 30 compressions. 2 breaths. 30 compressions. 2 breaths. The precision was mechanical, inhuman, the kind of precision that came from having done this while rounds of incoming fire snapped past her head and the patient was bleeding out faster than fluids could replace. Dr. Ashford's voice cut through the room like a blade. "Security. I need security in ICU step down now." Katie didn't stop. She ran the sequence. Compressions. Airway check. Another round of epi that she called out to a stunned resident who moved on autopilot and pushed it into the fall line. The 12 doctors stood frozen, half watching, half horrified, a semicircle of white coats that had already written the major off as unsalvageable. One of them whispered something to another. Katie heard it anyway. What is she doing? The rest of them didn't move. They just watched. At minute 4, Dr. Ashford physically tried to pull her off the bed. She shoved him back without breaking rhythm, a move that was pure combat muscle memory, the kind of shove that came from a woman who'd learned to fight in body armor under 95-degree heat, and he stumbled backward into the medication cart. Glass bottles rattled. One fell and shattered on the tile floor. The room gasped. Katie kept going. Compressions. The Major's ribs were solid beneath her palms, his chest rising and falling with the force of her work, his body responding to her will because his own heart had forgotten how. 2 security guards appeared in the doorway at minute 6, their hands hovering near their radios, but they didn't move. They just stood there, paralyzed by the sight of a nurse, a small, quiet woman in green scrubs, working with the kind of controlled ferocity that made even uniformed men hesitate. One of them looked at the other. Neither moved. They knew, on some level, that what was happening at that bedside was not civilian nursing. It was something else entirely. Something that required a different kind of authority to stop, and they didn't have it. At minute 9, one of the hospitalists whispered to the resident beside him, "She's actually maintaining viable compressions." Katie's shirt was soaked through with sweat. Her shoulders burned. The rhythm was perfect, 100 compressions per minute, the same rhythm she'd maintained while kneeling in the dust outside a Humvee with a soldier's ribcage open to the Afghanistan sun, her hands slick with blood and diesel fuel, counting cadence in her head because the only sound was the wind and the distant sound of helicopters, and she couldn't think about anything except the next compression, the next breath, the next 10 seconds of keeping a human being alive when everything in the world was conspiring to kill him. At minute 12, the rhythm of her hands had become hypnotic. Push. Release. Push. Release. The monitor still showed the same flat catastrophe, but Katie could feel something changing. The resistance under her palms was different. The blood was moving. She could feel it. At minute 17, the Major's monitor spiked. A single peak. Then another. Then a rhythm, weak, irregular, but present. Sinus rhythm. His heart was beating. Katie felt it the moment his own pulse synchronized with hers, the moment his body remembered how to live, and she stepped back, her hands finally dropping, shaking now, covered in sweat that dripped onto the tile floor in small dark puddles. The room erupted in controlled chaos. Someone was bagging the Major. Someone else was calling for labs. A resident was moving to check the monitor, checking it again, whispering into her phone, "His back. His heart's back." The silence lasted exactly 2 seconds. Then Dr. Ashford's voice cut through the room like a gunshot. "You're done. You're done here." His face was white, then red, then something in between. His hands were clenched at his sides. He was breathing hard, his chest heaving, and Katie understood in that moment that she had broken something in him, not just his authority, but his control, his carefully constructed narrative that only doctors saved lives and nurses followed orders. She had stepped outside the boundaries he'd drawn, and the boundaries had held no power over her because she'd spent 16 years operating in territories where there were no boundaries at all. "You violated every protocol. You overstepped. You assaulted me." His voice was climbing now, each sentence sharper than the last. "Security, I'm pressing charges for battery. Remove her from this facility immediately." The 2 security guards moved forward, finally, but they moved slowly, uncertainly, as if they were wading through water. One of them approached Katie with his hands open, apologetic. "I'm going to need you to come with us." Katie didn't resist. She stepped away from the bedside, away from the Major, her hands still shaking but her face empty of any emotion. She looked at Dr. Ashford once, just once, and in that single moment of eye contact, something passed between them, not fear, not anger, but a kind of terrible recognition. He understood now that he'd been wrong about her. He understood now that the quiet woman he'd dismissed, the nurse he'd moved to overnight shifts, the person he'd decided was beneath his notice, had just accomplished what 12 surgeons and hospitalists could not. The realization didn't comfort him. It enraged him. By 0400 hours, Katie's badge was gone. The security guard at the front desk took it from her with an apology she didn't acknowledge. By 0600, there was an envelope in her locker. She didn't open it until she was sitting in her car in the parking lot. The letterhead said Oak Creek Memorial Human Resources. The language was sterile: gross insubordination and unauthorized medical intervention, terminate employment effective immediately, no notice period, security escort to retrieve personal items, final paycheck will be mailed. She folded the letter and set it on the passenger seat. She drove to Riverview Cemetery in the rain, her scrubs still on, the fabric clinging to her skin in patches where she'd sweated through them. The rain hammered the windshield in a rhythm that matched her heartbeat, loud and accusatory. She parked near the back fence where she'd parked 100 times before, climbed out without locking the door, and walked through mud that soaked through her white sneakers and crept up the leg of her scrubs. The headstone was small, grey granite, with 2 names engraved in brass letters that had begun to tarnish. She knelt in front of it, not bothering to find dry ground. The mud was cold. Her knee sank into it. The rain was falling harder now, running down her face, mixing with something else, tears, maybe, or just the rain, she couldn't tell anymore. The dog tag on the broken chain swung free from her neck, cold against her chest, the metal chain cutting into her skin. It was her tag. Not his. She'd kept her own and buried his with the empty casket, because there was nothing else left to bury. The coffin flag had been wrong. The medals had been wrong. The honor guard had been wrong. The only true thing at his funeral was her dog tag, the only piece of her past she'd allowed herself to keep, the only reminder that she'd been someone before she'd become a widow. I couldn't save him, she whispered to the rain and the stone and the name carved into the granite. Derek, I couldn't save him. I couldn't save any of it. The rain fell harder. She didn't move. She knelt there in the mud, in her scrubs, wearing the dog tag of a person who no longer existed, and watched the rain run down the headstone in small rivulets that looked like tears. The cemetery was empty except for her. There was no one to hear what she said next, no one to see the moment when her shoulders straightened, when her hands stopped shaking, when something in her face went very still and very quiet. But that wasn't the worst part. 1 week later, Oak Creek Memorial's board met in the executive conference room on the 4th floor. 8 board members. The hospital administrator, Helen Cho. The legal counsel. Dr. Ashford at the head of the polished mahogany table, his suit pressed, his voice reasonable, explaining why the termination was justified, necessary, unavoidable. His hands were folded in front of him. He was very calm. The door slammed open. Marcus Morrison stood in the doorway, 17 years old, wearing his Army PT shirt. In his hands was a shadow box. Behind him, 3 steps back, was Katie. Her face was pale. She was trying to pull Marcus back by the shoulder. Marcus, don't. He ignored her and walked straight to the table. He set the shadow box down in front of Dr. Ashford with the kind of deliberate care that only came from knowing exactly what he was doing. The medals inside caught the fluorescent light: bronze, silver, ribbon, ribbon. Major Katie Morrison, Marcus said, his voice steady. United States Army. The room went silent. Dr. Ashford's mouth opened and closed. His face went the color of old paper. 1 week later, Marcus Morrison pushed through the glass doors of the hospital board conference room carrying a shadow box. The medals inside caught the fluorescent light like evidence. Bronze star with Valor. Purple heart. Combat medical badge with 2 stars. Army Commendation Medal. Each one mounted on Navy felt, each one earned in a place that didn't exist on Katie's paperwork, in a life she'd tried to bury under 3 years of 12-hour shifts and quiet competence at Oak Creek Memorial. Helen Cho, the hospital administrator, sat at the head of the polished mahogany table with Dr. Ashford's termination letter in front of her. The board members flanked her on both sides. Katie wasn't in the room. She'd been told to wait outside, that her son wanted to speak on her behalf. They thought he was a concerned family member, nothing more. Marcus was 17, 5 feet 11 inches, with the same steady jaw as his mother and eyes that had seen things most high school seniors hadn't. He'd been training with Major Holloway's Special Forces unit for 8 months. That training had taught him how to recognize command presence. His mother had taught him everything else. He set the shadow box on the table between Helen Cho and Dr. Ashford. "Mom, they need to see these." His voice was level, military crisp in a way that made 3 board members shift in their chairs. "They need to know who you really are." The room went dead silent. Dr. Ashford's face had already gone the color of old paper, but now he leaned back in his chair, calculating. The shadow box meant nothing. Medals could belong to anyone. He'd won before against weaker opposition. He was wrong about almost everything. Marcus turned to face the full board, and when he spoke, his 17-year-old voice carried the weight of someone who'd heard his commanding officer talk about his mother at FOB Shank, at Kabul, in briefings where Katie Morrison's name appeared on classified rosters under titles that didn't match trauma nurse. Major Katie Morrison, United States Army. The room didn't just go quiet. The room stopped existing. The ambient hum of the building seemed to pause. Helen Cho's pen fell from her fingers and rolled across the mahogany, and nobody stopped it. A board member, an older man with steel-gray hair, reached for the shadow box with trembling hands. Not the weak trembling of fear. The trembling of someone touching something they suddenly understood was real in a way they'd never considered. He lifted the medals one at a time, his reading glasses slipping down his nose. Helen Cho opened Katie's personnel file with the same trembling hands. Her voice cracked on dates as she read aloud, nursing degree from Oregon Health and Science University, 2018. RN licensure, 2018. Hired at Oak Creek Memorial, 2021. 3 years of perfect performance reviews. 3 years of no disciplinary action. 3 years of documented crisis interventions and patient advocacy that the reviews had actually praised until Dr. Ashford's arrival. Then Helen's voice changed. It hardened. Medical credentials on file as of 2018. She looked up at Dr. Ashford. But these discharge papers. They're stamped United States Department of Defense, Medical Separation Agreement, Honorable. The date is 2013. The rank listed is, she stopped. Started again. The rank listed is Major Catherine Ann Morrison, Army Combat Medical Specialist, JSOC Task Force Designation, classified. A barrel-chested man in a faded Navy SEAL t-shirt stood up from the visitor gallery. He was Major Holloway's brother, there at Derek's request, sitting silently until his testimony became necessary. His shoulders were the width of a car door. His hands looked like they'd pulled men out of burning buildings, because they had. Bronze Star with Valor, he said, pointing at the first medal. His voice was granite. Awarded for medevac operations under enemy fire, Helm and Province, 2011. A pause. The board felt the weight of every word. Purple Heart. He pointed again. 2 of them. One from fragmentation wound sustained during the Bagram training complex attack, 2012. One from burns sustained during extraction of 3 wounded personnel from a disabled Black Hawk, 2013. Helen Cho's assistant was making notes. Dr. Ashford's jaw had tightened into a thin line. Combat Medical Badge with 2 stars, the SEAL continued. That means Combat Medical Specialist in 2 separate combat zones. She didn't process paperwork. She kept people alive when the helicopters couldn't land, when the surgical teams were 70 miles away, when the only thing between bleeding out and survival was someone who understood anatomy like a surgeon and could work under fire like a soldier. The last medal. The one that made Helen Cho close her eyes for a moment. Army Commendation Medal. That one's for exceptional leadership during classified operations. The SEAL sat down. I've trained with her son. I know what he's becoming. Half of it is genetics. The other half is having a mother who chose to save lives instead of take them. An FBI liaison, there for the review process regarding Major Holloway's case, cleared his throat and started to explain the classified medevac mission that had earned Katie her medical discharge in 2013. The explosion. The decision to stay with wounded personnel instead of evacuate. The burns. The internal bleeding that required surgery she couldn't get in theatre. The discharge papers marked unsuitable for continued active duty due to service-connected disability and honourable discharge. But before the liaison could finish, Dr. Ashford reached for his phone. It was muscle memory. Instinct. The universal gesture of a man trying to delete evidence, call allies, make the problem vanish the way he'd made Katie vanish. One of the IT directors stood up. Young. Crew cut. A Marine for 5 years before going into hospital technology. His name was Patterson, and he'd been flagged by the security team to audit server logs after Katie's firing. He'd found what every competent investigator finds: a paper trail is one thing, but digital footprints are forever. I've already submitted a mirror copy of every security footage frame from the night of Major Holloway's resuscitation, Patterson said quietly. The external drive is in front of you, counsel. He gestured at the board's legal counsel, who looked at the small black drive like it was a nuclear briefcase. 17 minutes of footage. Katie's hands moving on the Major's chest with precision. Her voice calling out times and counts. Her eyes locked on the monitor as O2 sat climbed from 68 to 78 to 88. Her refusing to stop even when 12 doctors had already walked away. Dr. Ashford's hand fell back to the table. I also found, Patterson continued, his voice like ice water, 7 attempts to access and delete those files from Dr. Ashford's administrative login between 2100 hours last night and 0400 this morning. All time-stamped. All recorded. I have the access logs, the deletion attempts, and the recovery protocols. Everything's on the drive. The security guards who were standing near the door, the same two who'd hesitated to remove Katie from Major Holloway's room a week earlier, moved toward Dr. Ashford in synchronized motion. No dramatics. No shouting. They simply walked him out of the conference room with the efficiency of people trained to move threats from positions of power. His suit jacket hung loose on his shoulders as they escorted him into the hallway. The conference room doors closed behind him. The board convened for investigation. But that wasn't the end. That was just the beginning of the reckoning. 6 months later, Katie Morrison walked through the employee entrance at Oak Creek Memorial in navy scrubs with a new badge clipped to her collar. The badge was rectangular. The title on it read, Director of Emergency Medicine. The hospital had appointed her after the investigation concluded. Dr. Ashford's license had been suspended by the State Medical Board for 2 years, improper conduct, failure to follow standard resuscitation protocols, systematic abuse of power. His hospital privileges were permanently revoked. The other nurses he'd reassigned came back to regular shifts. The residents who'd filed complaints that he'd buried found advocates. The protocols that had enabled his control were rewritten. Katie had requested one condition before accepting the promotion: unit procedures would be reformed to protect nurses who advocated for patients. The board had agreed immediately. They understood now what they'd almost lost. It was 0200 hours on her 3rd day as director when she saw him. Dr. Ashford was standing at the employee entrance in a Navy security uniform, scanning badges with a handheld device. The position no one wanted. The position assigned to people management wanted to punish. His face was blank, shoulders slumped, eyes moving from ID to face in the mechanical rhythm of someone doing work that required nothing from him, not intelligence, not judgment, not the authority he'd once wielded like a weapon. The night shift security guard. The most senior doctor in the hospital, reduced to checking badges in the dark. Katie's shift in the trauma unit had ended. She had rounds to review, supply orders to approve, new protocols to implement. She walked past him toward the exit, her dog tag catching the fluorescent light just enough for him to see, not hidden anymore beneath her scrubs, but visible. A reminder. A statement. She didn't slow down. Didn't speak. Didn't acknowledge him beyond the simple physics of two people sharing the same space for 1 second. The automatic doors slid open. Cool Portland air hit her face, carrying the smell of rain on asphalt and the ozone remnant of a distant storm. Behind her, she heard the shuffle of his feet, the soft beep of the scanner as another employee approached. In the parking lot, Marcus was waiting, leaning against her car in army fatigues. He was on leave from his unit. He'd be deploying in 4 months. Right now, he was her son, grinning like he'd won something. "How was the first day as director, Mom?" She smiled, tired but real, the kind of smile that comes from surviving something and choosing to build again. "It was good." They drove home as the sun rose over Portland, painting the sky in shades of amber and grey. Katie's hands were steady on the wheel. The dog tag caught the morning light as she drove, and for the first time in 8 years, she didn't reach up to hide it. Back at Oak Creek Memorial, the trauma bay was quiet at dawn. The hallways were empty except for the night custodians pushing their carts, cleaning surfaces for the day's shift. The security desk where Dr. Ashford sat alone was bathed in the pale blue glow of his scanner. And on the trauma unit wall, stenciled in clean white letters, was the door to the director's office. Catherine and Morrison, Major, United States Army. 3 tours. 2 Purple Hearts. 1 broken dog tag she'd kept when she stopped running from who she was. Heroes walk among us. Sometimes in scrubs, saving lives in the dark. If you've ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your real value, subscribe and like this video. And in the comments, tell me, would you have saved him, or would you have walked away? Thank you for watching.